Being rich in Brazil or middle class in the US, which is better? This is a question I've been thinking a lot about recently because I've got Brazilian friends who are desperate to move to the US and also some friends in the US who are thinking of moving to Brazil. So I thought I'd do a video sharing my thoughts on which is better. Now the answer to this question depends a lot on how you define being rich in Brazil and middle class in the US. So I asked Google Gemini how it would define these two terms, and it said that to be classified as rich in Brazil, you need to be part of the top 1% of earners in Brazil, which means that you need to have a monthly income between 24,000 reais and 103,000 reais. So that's $5,000 to $20,000 per month, or $60,000 to $240,000 per year. And then in terms of how much you need to earn to be classified as middle class in the US, so Google Gemini defined that as anyone earning between $56,000 to $169,000 per year. So what you can see from this is that the majority of the middle class in the US, if they were to move to Brazil and earn the same amount of money, then they would be classified as rich here in Brazil. While the opposite is true as well, in that a lot of the rich Brazilians, if they were to move to the US and earn the same amount, then they would be classified as middle class rather than rich. Okay, so now let's have a look at what your lifestyle is like if you're rich in Brazil and middle class in the US. And let's start off by looking at buying a home. And the majority of people watching this would probably say, yeah, it's definitely cheaper to buy a house in Brazil. And so if you're rich in Brazil, you'll be able to afford a much nicer house than you would if you were middle class in the US. And that is right in most cases, but there are some surprises. So if we look at the cost per square feet or square meter of buying a home in the US, the average for the whole of the US is $227 per square feet, which is $2,400 per square meter. And if we look at the whole of Brazil, the average is 9,800 reais per square meter, which is $1,900 per square meter. So overall, the cost of buying a new home in the US is about 25% more expensive than Brazil. And when I saw this, I was quite surprised. I was like, that can't be right. That's not what I've experienced. But you have to remember, these are two very big countries with some big regional differences in values. So in order to get a better comparison, you have to look at individual regions or states. And probably if you're earning $50,000 to $150,000 and you're moving to Brazil, you're probably going to choose a nice city or town near the coast, or one in the countryside, but which is still a couple hours from the coast, so you can easily go to some nice beaches. Some ideal cities would be in Santa Catarina. So you've got Florianópolis, Blumenau, Joinville, and obviously much smaller towns as well. And then also some nice cities and towns in Sao Paulo. One that I really like is São José dos Campos, which is very organized and again, only a couple hours drive from the coast. And then also further north, you've got other cities like João Pessoa, again on the coast, and very nice beaches. And if we look at the cost per square meter of these cities, it varies between $1,600 per square meter, $2,600 per square meter. And if you wanted to live in a similar area in the US, so not too far away from nice beaches, two main options are California and Florida. And the cost per square meter of property in California is $4,900 per square meter, and in Florida it's lower at $2,800 per square meter. That's an average for the whole state, and if you look at individual cities there, so you've got Miami, which is over $5,300 per square meter, lots of Sarasota, Fort Lauderdale, they're all at $4,000 per square meter. So you can see from this that if you want to live in a nice city, close to the coast, with nice beaches, then you're going to pay a lot more in the US compared to Brazil. And in terms of my own experience, for $200,000 to $300,000, so $1 million reais to 1.5 million reais, you can get a really nice house or really nice apartment in some very safe, beautiful areas near the coast in Brazil, and that's going to be very difficult in the US. So in terms of property, in my opinion, Brazil wins this one. Okay, so now let's have a look at buying some other things, and firstly let's look at cars. So the cost of cars here in Brazil can be relatively high because of the high sales tax on the cars, but it depends on what type of car you buy. So if we look at Jeep, so this is a brand which is very popular in Brazil. Brazilians love to buy American cars. So if you look at the Jeep Compass, So this is a middle-sized SUV, and the price for one of these in Brazil starts at 147,000 reais, which is $29,000. And in the US, the price starts at $30,000. So you can see the prices are very similar, and this is partly because Jeep manufactures these cars in Brazil, which means that the sales tax is lower on these cars. But also there are some differences between a Jeep in Brazil and in the US. So a lot of car manufacturers, they strip out features out of cars sold in Brazil in order to reduce down the cost. And so you can't do a like-for-like comparison between these two cars. But even taking this into consideration, you can see the prices aren't too different. However, if you look at other cars which are imported, then you'll see a big difference. So if you look at Mercedes, for example, so all Mercedes cars are imported, which means that the sales taxes and also the import taxes are very high. And let's just take the Mercedes C-Class. So in Brazil it starts at 396,000 reais, which is $76,000. And in the US it starts at $49,000. And so if you're after cars like this, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Range Rover, then it's a lot more accessible in the US compared to Brazil. And the same applies to other manufactured goods and electronics. So if you look at cell phones or mobile phones, so for example an Apple iPhone 17, the price in the US is $799. In Brazil, because of higher sales taxes and other things, the phone is much more expensive. So it costs around 6,000 reais, which is $1,100. And the same applies to other things like TVs. So if we look at a Samsung 50-inch TV, it's about 2,300 reais here in Brazil, which is $470. While in the US, you could get it for around $300. So in terms of buying manufactured goods and electronics, it's a lot more affordable and accessible to the middle class in the US compared to someone earning a similar amount in Brazil. And then if we look at cost of services, so I'm talking about cleaners, tradesmen, gardeners, dentists, and then also health insurance as well. So all of these in general are cheaper in Brazil compared to the US. So I'll just share with you how much I pay for these things. So for a cleaner we pay 70 reais, which is $14 for the cleaner to come for half a day to clean our house. For a gardener we pay 90 reais, which is $18, again for half a day for them to cut the grass and do a couple of things. My health insurance is 500 reais, which is $98 per month. And so that I've got access to private doctors, specialists, hospitals, and surgeries. And when I go to a dentist, I pay 150 reais, which is $30 for a checkup and a clean. And then finally, recently I had to call a plumber over, managed to drill into a pipe in the wall. The water started bursting out. And I paid him 200 reais, which is $40. For him to go to the property, fix it, includes all the materials and everything. And all of these costs are much lower than what I had when I was living in the US. And so paying for services here in Brazil is much cheaper than in the US. And then finally, another cost you have is taxes. Now here I'm just going to talk about income tax, because I already talked about sales tax on manufactured goods and cars and so on. But in terms of the tax on your income, so this varies a lot depending on how much you earn. So the top rate of tax in Brazil is 27.5%, while in the US the top rate of federal income tax is 37%, but then you've got state taxes as well, so it can go up to over 50%. So that would suggest that you pay more tax in the US. However, you start paying the top rate of income tax in Brazil a lot quicker at a much lower income. So it all depends on how much you earn. So what that means is that if your income is relatively low, you actually pay more tax in Brazil than the US. But if you earn a lot, then the tax will be lower in Brazil compared to the US. Okay, so those are kind of the financial considerations, but then obviously you have many non-financial factors as well that you need to take into consideration when you're comparing the two countries. So one of them being infrastructure and public services. So I'm talking about schools, roads, sanitation, policing. Obviously it depends on the area that you live in, but in general the US invests more in these things than Brazil. And obviously one thing that I didn't mention there was healthcare. So Brazil has a public healthcare system called SUS, which is free. But the majority of the rich in Brazil, they have private health insurance, because the level of service you get from the public health system here in Brazil sometimes isn't the best, and you can have long waiting queues and so on. And so for $100 to $200 per month, you can get private health insurance and access to private hospitals and so on, which are very good. So in terms of this aspect, it's better in the US. However, I will say that it really depends on where you live. And there are some smaller towns and cities in Brazil where the infrastructure and public services are pretty good. But in general, it's better in the US. And then another factor is crime and security. So overall, crime is higher in Brazil compared to the US. So we look at homicide rates. So the homicide rate per 100,000 in Brazil is 18, compared to the US, where it's 4.9. But there's some big regional differences. And when I lived in the US, I went to some cities which I did not feel safe in. And obviously you got the same in Brazil, but then you also have some very safe cities in Brazil, especially in the countryside. And also I would say that I feel safer here in Brazil when it comes to being in public spaces and not being worried that there's some crazy person who's going to pull out a firearm and start shooting randomly. So this happens less here in Brazil than it does in the US. Finally, another factor is bureaucracy as well. So in general, there is a lot of bureaucracy here in Brazil, especially for someone who's moving to Brazil. There's lots of things that you need to do in terms of getting your ID, your tax number, your driving license, and so on. And this can be very frustrating. And obviously, you have bureaucracy as well in the US. And I remember when I moved to the US, there were some frustrating things there as well. But in general, it is less in the US compared to Brazil. So if you're someone who gets easily frustrated with these things, then that can be a problem here in Brazil. And you might have to spend some money to pay people to deal with this bureaucracy. So then that would be another cost that you have here in Brazil. And then a final factor to consider is opportunities. So I'm talking about job opportunities, being able to create a business in the country. And most people would probably say that the US has more opportunities than Brazil. And yeah, I agree in terms of being able to get a high-paying job. Then definitely it's easier in the US, where salaries are much higher. And also in terms of starting a business, there are fewer hurdles and less bureaucracy in the US. And the business will have access to one of the biggest and most affluent markets in the world. But I personally think that things are changing in the US a bit, and the opportunities aren't what they used to be. And also in Brazil, you have the advantage of the market in Brazil not being as developed. And so there are more opportunities to launch a new product in Brazil, which is being sold overseas, but is new to Brazil. Obviously, there are many hurdles in terms of high taxes, bureaucracy, and the Brazilian market is smaller and less affluent. But that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities here in Brazil as well. Okay, so those are some of the factors you need to consider if you're comparing whether life is better being rich in Brazil compared to being middle class in the US. And in my opinion, if you're earning like $50,000 to $150,000 per year, then life is better here in Brazil compared to the US. You're able to buy a bigger and nicer property near nice beaches here in Brazil. Also, you're able to afford to pay for lots of help, cleaners, gardeners. Also, you don't need to worry about being able to afford health insurance as well, because that's very reasonable. And also, if you choose the right area in Brazil, then you can actually feel safer living here in Brazil than you would in the US. But it's not all positive in Brazil. There are some drawbacks. So even if you're classified as rich here in Brazil, you might not be able to afford the luxury car that you want, which you would be able to afford in the US. Also in terms of electronics and luxury goods, these may also be more expensive in Brazil. And then also you may suffer from the extra bureaucracy, the poor public services, and the infrastructure. So if you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe. If you've got any comments, leave it in the comment section below. So thanks for watching, until next time.